Welcome to Crazy HOA Moments. The vendor showed up fast because she kept them paid. I am standing beside my car in the visitor lot at 6:45 in the morning when Evelyn Howard steps into the frame with her phone raised and her mouth already open. "You are going to stop recording me," she says, except I am not recording anything yet. I am holding my coffee and my work keys and trying to figure out why a tow truck is backing into the space behind my sedan. The neighbor across the street started filming and Karen screamed that filming was harassment and she would tow my car for that too. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a neighborhood called Towline Oaks Ridge Association, and I am an HVAC dispatcher who records every call and ticket that comes through my system because that is how you stay employed when techs blame you for their mistakes. Right now I need that same discipline because my guest pass expires tonight and Evelyn is betting on the clock. She waves the clipboard at me and says the guest parking rules changed last week and my pass does not count anymore because it was issued under the old system. I ask her what old system. We have had the same guest pass policy for 2 years. She says I decide what counts as compliant, not you, and that phrase lands like a slap because I know it means she is done pretending this is about rules. I glance at the tow truck driver, a guy in his 50s with a company logo on his shirt, and he will not make eye contact. Evelyn snaps her gloves again, a little pop of rubber that she does for intimidation, and tells me the vehicle will be immobilized if I do not move it immediately, but the truck is already blocking me in, so moving it is impossible. I ask her how I am supposed to move a car that is boxed in by her tow truck, and she says that is not her problem. I should have thought about that before I parked illegally. The driver climbs out and starts positioning the wheel lift under my rear axle. I tell him I have a valid guest pass on the dashboard, and he says he was told this vehicle is unauthorized. Evelyn interrupts and says she called the tow company an hour ago because she observed the violation during her morning compliance walk, which is a fancy way of saying she patrols the neighborhood looking for cars to target. She holds up a Ziploc bag with a torn permit backing inside, the adhesive still tacky, and says this is proof I tampered with HOA property. I have no idea what that torn backing is or where it came from, but she waves it like it is a smoking gun. I pull out my phone and she screams that recording is harassment and she will have my car towed for that too, which does not make sense because the car is already being towed, but logic is not her priority right now. The neighbor across the street, an older guy named Ron who is a retired police officer, steps onto his driveway and raises his phone. Evelyn pivots and shouts at him to stop filming or she will report him for violating the community harassment policy. Ron does not lower his phone. He says filming in public is legal, and if she wants to talk about harassment, she should start with the tow truck blocking the fire lane. Evelyn says the fire lane rule does not apply to authorized HOA enforcement activities, which is something she clearly made up on the spot. Ron walks closer and tells the tow driver that if he hooks that car without verifying the complaint, he is going to be part of a legal problem. And the driver pauses, his hand on the control lever, looking between Evelyn and Ron like he is trying to figure out who outranks who in this situation. Evelyn tells the driver to ignore Ron because Ron is not a board member and does not have enforcement authority. The driver says he needs to call his boss. Evelyn says if he calls his boss, she will make sure the HOA switches to a different tow company, and that threat lands because the driver stops reaching for his phone and goes back to the controls. I say I am calling the police because this is theft, and Evelyn laughs and says we can tow first and explain later. That is how enforcement works. That line is going to haunt her later, but right now, it just makes me angrier. Ron tells me to keep my phone recording and to get the driver's name and the truck number, which I do, reading them aloud so they are on the audio. The driver looks uncomfortable, but does not stop working. The wheel lift starts to rise and my car tilts backward. I feel a spike of panic because I am paying for a family medical expense and every bogus fee hurts. And if they take my car to the impound lot, I am looking at $300 minimum just to get it back, plus whatever Evelyn decides to charge me for the so-called violation. I ask her one more time what rule I broke, and she says the guest parking amendment was posted in the newsletter and on the website, which I know is a lie, because I check the website every week for exactly this kind of ambush. She says ignorance is not an excuse, and the immobilization fee is $150, due immediately, or the vehicle goes to the tow yard and the fee doubles. I tell her I want to see the amendment in writing and she says I can request it through the formal records process, which takes 10 business days, and by then the car will be long gone. Ron steps closer and says he is going to file a complaint with the county about predatory towing, and Evelyn says he can file whatever he wants, but it will not change the outcome today. The driver secures the wheel lift and walks around to the front of my car, pulling a tire clamp from the truck bed. I realize she is not just towing me, she is immobilizing the car first, which means even if I pay the fee right now, I still cannot move it until someone comes back to remove the clamp. Ron sees it too and says this is extortion, and Evelyn says it is compliance enforcement, and if Ron does not stop interfering, she will report him for obstruction. Ron tells her to go ahead and report him. He has dealt with worse than her, and I believe him because his tone has that calm cop authority that makes people nervous. The driver snaps the clamp shut and hands Evelyn a slip of paper, which she folds and tucks into her clipboard without showing me. She says the immobilization will remain until I pay the fee and submit a corrected guest registry form, which is a new requirement she is clearly inventing right now. I ask where I get the form, and she says the office opens at 9, which is more than 2 hours away, and I have to be at work in 30 minutes. She says that is not her concern, and I should have planned better. Ron asks her if she realizes she just admitted on camera that she is deliberately trapping someone who needs to get to work, and she says the camera does not scare her because everything she is doing is within her authority as communications director. I take a breath and decide to stop reacting and start documenting. I walk around the car, filming the clamp, the wheel lift, the truck number, the fire lane curb where the truck is parked, and Evelyn standing there with her clipboard and her gloves and her smug expression. I film Ron as a witness. I film the torn permit backing in the Ziploc bag, which she is still holding like it proves something. She tells me to stop pointing the camera at her, and I say I am filming the HOA enforcement activity, not her, and if she does not want to be on camera, she can step out of the frame. She does not step out of the frame. She steps closer and says I am violating her privacy, and she will add a harassment complaint to my file, which will trigger a hearing and possibly a fine. Ron says the harassment complaint is going to backfire because the video clearly shows her escalating and threatening, and Evelyn says Ron does not know what he is talking about because he is not a lawyer. Ron says he does not need to be a lawyer to recognize abuse of power, and Evelyn says abuse of power is a serious accusation and she will forward it to the HOA attorney for review. I can see her trying to create a paper trail that makes her look like the victim, and I know that if I do not get ahead of this right now, I am going to spend the next 6 months fighting violations that she invents faster than I can dispute them. I tell her I am filing a formal complaint with the board and requesting an emergency hearing, and she laughs and says the board does not schedule emergency hearings for parking violations. I will have to wait until the next regular meeting, which is 3 weeks away. The tow driver climbs back into his truck, and Evelyn tells him to take the vehicle to the impound lot. I say I thought she wanted the immobilization fee, and she says the fee was for if I paid immediately, but since I chose to argue and film instead of complying, the vehicle is now subject to tow and impound. Ron steps in front of the truck and says the driver is not moving until the police arrive to verify the complaint. Evelyn pulls out her phone and says she is calling the police herself to report Ron for obstructing a lawful tow, and Ron says go ahead. He will wait. I call the non-emergency line and explain that my HOA is attempting to tow my car based on a rule change they cannot produce, and a compliance director who is threatening me on camera, and the dispatcher says an officer will be out when one is available, but it might be 20 or 30 minutes because they are handling a traffic accident on the other side of town. Evelyn hears that and smiles. She tells the driver to proceed, and Ron does not move. The driver revs the engine, and Ron still does not move, and for a second I think this is going to turn into something worse. But then a sheriff's cruiser pulls into the lot with no lights or siren, just a slow roll like the deputy was already nearby and decided to check it out. Evelyn immediately switches her tone, putting her phone away and adjusting her blazer like she is greeting a guest at a garden party. The deputy gets out, a woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense expression, and asks what is going on. Evelyn jumps in first and says the HOA is enforcing a parking violation, and this resident is refusing to comply and his friend is obstructing the tow truck. The deputy looks at Ron, who says he is not obstructing anything. He is standing in a public parking lot waiting for law enforcement to verify that the tow is legitimate. The deputy asks Evelyn for documentation of the violation, and Evelyn pulls out the clipboard, flipping through pages until she finds a printed email. She hands it to the deputy and says the email was sent to all residents 2 weeks ago announcing the guest parking amendment. The deputy reads it and asks me if I received the email. I say I never received it, and I check my email daily because part of my job is managing service tickets that come through digitally, so I would have seen it. Evelyn says failure to read HOA communications is not a defense, and the amendment is binding regardless of whether I acknowledged it. The deputy asks to see my guest pass, and I point to the dashboard where it is clearly visible, showing today's date and my unit number. The deputy asks Evelyn what the amendment changed, and Evelyn says the new rule requires all guest passes to be registered in advance through the online portal and confirmed by the compliance office before the guest arrives. I say that is not what the old rule required, and I followed the old rule exactly, and Evelyn says the old rule expired when the amendment took effect. The deputy asks when the amendment took effect, and Evelyn says 2 weeks ago, the same day the email was sent. The deputy asks if there is any record of me receiving the email, and Evelyn says the HOA is not responsible for individual email delivery. Residents are responsible for monitoring communications. Ron says he never received the email either, and he is on the board, so maybe the email was never sent to anyone except the people Evelyn wanted to target. Evelyn says Ron is not on the compliance committee, so he would not have been included in the distribution. And Ron says the compliance committee does not have the authority to change parking rules without a board vote. And Evelyn says the board delegated enforcement authority to the compliance committee at the last meeting. Ron says he was at the last meeting and no such delegation happened, and Evelyn says Ron is misremembering because the minutes clearly show the vote. Ron says he wants to see the minutes, and Evelyn says he can request them through the formal records process. The deputy asks Evelyn if she has a copy of the board minutes, and Evelyn says she does not carry them with her, but they are available at the office. The deputy asks what time the office opens, and Evelyn says 9. The deputy looks at me and says if I have a guest pass that matches today's date and my unit number, and the HOA cannot produce written proof of a rule change that was properly noticed, then the tow does not appear to be justified. Evelyn says the tow is absolutely justified, and the deputy is interfering with private property enforcement. The deputy says private property enforcement still has to follow the law, and if the HOA is towing vehicles without proper notice of rule changes, that is a consumer protection issue and possibly a criminal matter. Evelyn's face goes red, and she says she has been doing compliance enforcement for 3 years and no one has ever questioned her authority before. The deputy says that does not mean the authority is legitimate, it just means no one challenged it until now. Evelyn says she is going to report the deputy to her supervisor for bias, and the deputy says she is welcome to do that, but right now the tow is on hold until the HOA produces documentation that the rule change was properly noticed and approved. Evelyn says the documentation exists and she will bring it to the office at 9, and the deputy says that is fine, but until then, the vehicle stays where it is and the clamp comes off. Evelyn says the clamp stays on because the immobilization fee has not been paid, and the deputy says if the tow is not justified, then the immobilization is not justified either, and Evelyn needs to remove the clamp now or the deputy will treat it as an unlawful restraint of property. Evelyn looks at the tow driver and tells him not to touch the clamp, and the driver says he is not getting involved in a legal dispute. He is just here to do the job he was hired for. The deputy tells the driver to remove the clamp, and the driver looks at Evelyn, who is practically vibrating with anger, and then he walks to the truck and gets the key. The clamp comes off and I feel a rush of relief so strong I almost laugh, but I keep my face neutral because this is not over. Evelyn tells the deputy she is filing a formal complaint, and the deputy hands her a business card and says she is welcome to do that. Here is the case number and the supervisor's name. The deputy walks to her cruiser and writes something on a clipboard, then comes back and hands me a slip of paper with an incident number. She says if the HOA tries to tow me again before they produce the documentation, I should call this number and reference the case. She tells Evelyn that if she retaliates against me for filing a complaint or involves law enforcement in bad faith again, she could be charged with filing a false report, and Evelyn says she has never filed a false report in her life. The deputy leaves and Evelyn turns on me with a look that could melt steel. She says this is not over, and I just made a very serious mistake by involving the police in an internal HOA matter. I say she is the one who involved the police by threatening an illegal tow, and she says the tow was completely legal and I am going to pay for this. She tells the tow driver to leave, and the driver does not need to be told twice. He is in his truck and pulling away before Evelyn finishes her sentence. Ron comes over and says I should get copies of all my emails and HOA correspondence because Evelyn is going to try to bury me in violations, and I should also request the board minutes for the last 6 months to prove that no parking amendment was ever approved. I thank Ron and drive to work, which is a small miracle because 10 minutes ago I thought my car was going to spend the day in an impound lot. I make it through my shift on autopilot, taking calls and dispatching texts and trying not to think about what Evelyn is planning next. But I know it is coming, because people like her do not let go of a grudge. They weaponize it. When I get home that afternoon, there is a notice taped to my door, printed on official HOA letterhead, saying I am being fined $200 for harassment of an HOA officer and failure to comply with a lawful enforcement action. The notice says I have 7 days to pay, or the fine will increase to $500 and I will be prohibited from using any common amenities until the balance is cleared. I read the notice 3 times, trying to figure out what part of this morning could possibly be called harassment, and then I realize it does not matter what actually happened because Evelyn controls the emails and the notices and the narrative, and unless I can prove she is lying, the board will take her W. Word over mine. I take a photo of the notice and send it to Ron, who calls me 5 minutes later and says this is retaliation and I need to file a complaint with the State Real Estate Commission because HOAs are required to follow fair housing and consumer protection laws. He says he is also going to raise it at the next board meeting because Evelyn is clearly abusing her position, and if the board does not rein her in, he is going to start organizing the neighborhood to vote her out. I spend the evening drafting a formal complaint to the board, laying out everything that happened this morning with timestamps and references to the video Ron and I recorded. I include the deputy's incident number and a request for copies of the board minutes showing the parking amendment vote, the email distribution list for the so-called notice, and any documentation of the Compliance Committee's enforcement authority. I send it to the board email address and copy Ron, and then I sit back and wait for Evelyn to escalate again, because that is what she does. The next morning, I get an email from the HOA management company saying my complaint has been received and will be reviewed at the next regular board meeting in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. I reply and say I need an emergency hearing because I am being charged fees and threatened with amenity lockouts based on rules that do not exist, and the management company replies that emergency hearings are only granted for safety issues or violations that pose immediate harm to the community. I write back and say an HOA officer threatening illegal tows and retaliatory fines is absolutely a safety issue, and the management company says they will forward my request to the board president. 2 days later, I get another notice, this one saying I damaged common property during the incident on the morning of the tow attempt, specifically that I kicked a traffic cone and left a scuff mark on the curb paint. The fine is $300, due immediately, and if I do not pay within 7 days, I will be charged an additional $50 per day until the balance is cleared. I did not kick a traffic cone. I walked around my car filming, and at one point Evelyn kicked a cone aside to block the lane, but apparently that does not matter, because the notice says a witness observed me damaging HOA property, and I must pay immediately or be charged daily. If you are enjoying this, hit like and subscribe for more stories where the paper trail fights back. I call Ron and tell him about the new fine, and he says Evelyn is trying to bury me in fees, so I either pay or go broke fighting it, and either way she wins. He says the daily fee structure is probably illegal because HOAs are required to give reasonable time to dispute charges before adding penalties, and I should send a formal dispute letter citing the state HOA statute. He also says I should file a complaint with the County Consumer Protection Office because predatory towing and fake damage claims fall under their jurisdiction. I do both, drafting the letters that night and sending them certified mail the next morning, but I know Evelyn is not going to stop. Just because I am filing complaints, she is going to find new ways to come at me until I either give up or move out. The following week, I get an email blast from the HOA saying there will be an emergency compliance sweep to address ongoing parking violations, and any vehicle found in violation will be towed immediately without warning. The email does not define what counts as a violation, it just says all residents must ensure their vehicles are compliant with current regulations. I reply and ask for a copy of the current regulations, and I get an auto response saying the office is closed for the day and my email will be reviewed when staff returns. I forward the email to Ron and he says the emergency sweep is targeted at me. Evelyn is trying to catch me in another violation so she can tow me, for real this time. I move my car to the street outside the neighborhood, which is public parking and outside the HOA's jurisdiction, and I walk the quarter mile to my unit every day. It is inconvenient and ridiculous, but it is better than giving Evelyn another chance to impound my car. Ron says I should document the fact that I am parking off-site because of HOA harassment, and if this ever goes to court, it will show that Evelyn's enforcement is so aggressive it is forcing residents to avoid their own neighborhood. I take photos of my car parked on the public street with timestamps, and I keep a log of every day I have to walk instead of parking in the visitor lot. 3 days before the board meeting, I get a call from the management company saying the meeting has been postponed because a quorum of board members is not available. I ask when it will be rescheduled, and the rep says they do not know yet. They will send an update when the new date is confirmed. I ask if my complaint will still be reviewed, and the rep says yes, but it will have to wait until the rescheduled meeting. I hang up and call Ron, who says he was also told about the postponement, and he is starting to suspect that Evelyn is manipulating the schedule to delay my hearing, because the longer I go without a resolution, the more pressure I am under to just pay the fines and move on. That night, I sit down and go through every email, notice, and document I have received from the HOA in the last 6 months. I pull up my email archives and search for anything related to parking rules or guest passes, and I find exactly 0 emails announcing a parking amendment. I check the HOA website and find the current parking policy, which matches the old policy I followed, with no mention of advanced registration or online portals. I screenshot everything and save it to a cloud folder, and then I draft a timeline showing exactly when each event happened, cross-referenced with the emails, notices, and the deputy's incident report. I also pull the HOA's own records request policy, which says residents are entitled to copies of board minutes, financial reports, and rule changes within 10 business days of a written request. I submit a formal records request asking for the board minutes from the last 6 months, the email distribution logs for the so-called parking amendment notice, and any documentation of the Compliance Committee's authority to change parking rules without a board vote. I send it certified mail, and I keep a copy of the tracking receipt, because I know Evelyn is going to claim she never received it or that I did not follow the proper procedure. 2 weeks go by, and I hear nothing from the HOA. No response to my records request, no update on the rescheduled meeting, no acknowledgement of my dispute letters. The fines are still on my account, now totaling over $800 with the daily penalties, and I get an email saying my amenity access has been suspended until the balance is cleared. I cannot use the pool, the gym, or the clubhouse, which I never use anyway, but the principle is infuriating because the fines are bogus and the suspension is punishment without due process. Ron tells me he raised my case at an informal board gathering, and 2 of the board members said they were not aware of any parking amendment or compliance sweep, and they asked Evelyn to produce the documentation. Evelyn told them the documentation was in the compliance files and she would bring it to the next meeting, but she also said my complaint was frivolous and I was wasting board time with baseless accusations. Ron says one of the board members seems sympathetic, but the other 2 are close to Evelyn and unlikely to vote against her unless the evidence is overwhelming. I realize I need to be ready to present my case in a way that leaves no room for debate, and that means I need the trump card I have been holding. I have been keeping it quiet because I wanted to see how far Evelyn would go before I dropped it, and now I know the answer. She will go as far as it takes to destroy me. I waited for the right audience, because the reveal needed witnesses. The trump card is a timestamp timeline packet that makes their story mathematically impossible, showing that the so-called parking amendment email was created the morning of the tow attempt, not 2 weeks earlier, and the metadata proves it. I pulled the metadata from the email Evelyn handed to the deputy, which she sent to me as part of her follow-up notice, and the file properties show it was created at 5:53 in the morning on the day of the tow, less than an hour before she showed up at my car. I cross-referenced it with the HOA's email server logs, which I obtained through a public records request to the management company, and there is no record of the email being sent to any residents 2 weeks earlier. The only email matching that content was sent to Evelyn herself, from her own account, at 5:53, which means she wrote it that morning to create a paper trail after the fact. I print the timeline packet with the metadata analysis, the email server logs, and the screenshot comparisons, and I put it all in a binder with tabs and a cover letter summarizing the findings. I make 3 copies, one for me, one for the board, and one for the HOA attorney, because I want to make sure that even if the board tries to bury it, the attorney will see it and understand the liability issue. I also add a section showing the retaliation timeline, with every fine, notice, and suspension Evelyn issued after I filed the first complaint, because the pattern is so obvious it is almost funny. The board meeting finally gets rescheduled for 2 weeks out, and Ron says he is going to make sure there is a quorum this time, even if he has to call every board member personally. He also says he is bringing his own documentation, including the fact that the compliance committee never received enforcement authority, and Evelyn has been acting outside her role for months. I feel a little better knowing I am not going into this alone, but I also know Evelyn is going to fight hard because if this timeline packet gets accepted as evidence, her entire compliance regime falls apart. The day before the meeting, I get a letter from the HOA attorney saying my records request was received and the board will provide a response at the meeting. The letter also says that due to the sensitive nature of the allegations, the meeting will be closed to non-residents and only board members, the accused parties, and their representatives will be allowed to attend. I assume that means Evelyn will be there, and I am fine with that because I want her in the room when I drop the timeline packet. The meeting is held at the clubhouse, in a conference room with a long table and uncomfortable chairs. I arrive 10 minutes early and Ron is already there, sitting at one end of the table with a folder in front of him. 3 board members show up: the president, a man in his 60s who looks like he would rather be anywhere else, the treasurer, a woman in her 50s who keeps glancing at her phone, and the secretary, a younger guy who takes notes on a laptop. Evelyn arrives last, walking in with her clipboard and her blazer and her gloves tucked into her pocket, and she sits across from me with a smile that does not reach her eyes. The president opens the meeting and says we are here to review my complaint against the compliance director and to discuss the parking enforcement incident. He asks me to summarize my complaint, and I do, keeping it factual and pointing to the deputy's incident report, the video evidence, and the records request that was never answered. Evelyn interrupts and says I am misrepresenting the situation. The parking amendment was properly noticed and I chose to ignore it, and the tow was justified under the HOA's enforcement authority. She pulls out the Ziploc bag with the torn permit backing and says this proves I tampered with HOA property, which is a separate violation. I let her finish and then I pull out the binder. I say I have new evidence that was not available when I filed the original complaint, and I would like to submit it to the board for review. The president asks what kind of evidence, and I say it is a metadata analysis of the email Evelyn provided to the deputy, showing that the email was created the morning of the tow attempt, not 2 weeks earlier as she claimed. Evelyn's face goes pale and she says that is absurd. The email was sent weeks ago and I am just making things up to avoid paying the fines. I open the binder and hand copies to each board member, walking them through the timeline packet page by page. I show the email file properties, the creation timestamp, the server logs, and the screenshot comparison. I show the lack of any prior email matching that content in the distribution logs. And I show the retaliation timeline with every fine and notice Evelyn issued after I filed the complaint. The room is silent except for the sound of pages turning and Ron's quiet commentary pointing out the key details. The treasurer looks up and says this is a serious allegation, and if it is true, it means the compliance director falsified enforcement documentation, which is grounds for removal. Evelyn says the metadata is meaningless because email files get updated all the time and it does not prove anything. I say the server logs prove it because there is no record of the email being sent to residents 2 weeks ago. The only send event is the self-send at 5:53 on the morning of the tow. The secretary asks Evelyn if she can produce the original email with the correct timestamp, and Evelyn says she does not keep copies of every email she sends. The server logs should have it. Ron says the server logs do not have it, and that is the point. Because the email was never sent to residents, it was created that morning to justify a tow that Evelyn had already ordered. The president asks Evelyn if she ordered the tow before sending the email, and Evelyn says she ordered the tow based on her observation of the violation during her morning compliance walk, and the email was just documentation. Ron says documentation that was created after the fact to cover up an illegal tow, and Evelyn says it was not illegal, it was enforcement, and she has the authority to enforce parking rules as the compliance director. The treasurer says the timeline packet also shows that the compliance committee never voted on the parking amendment, and the board never delegated enforcement authority, which means Evelyn has been acting outside her role for months. Evelyn says the board gave her verbal approval at a prior meeting and she has been operating under that understanding. The secretary pulls up the meeting minutes on his laptop and says there is no record of any verbal approval, and if it happened, it should have been documented. Evelyn says the secretary must have missed it when he was typing the minutes, and the secretary says he does not miss votes, that is his job. The president looks at the HOA attorney who has been sitting quietly in the corner and asks for a legal opinion. The attorney says if the timeline packet is accurate and the compliance director falsified enforcement documentation, then the HOA has significant liability exposure for wrongful towing, harassment, and retaliation. He says the HOA could be facing a lawsuit and possibly regulatory action from the State Real Estate Commission, and the board needs to take immediate corrective action to limit the damage. He also says the board should consider retaining outside counsel to investigate the compliance director's conduct, because if this goes to court, the HOA will need to show that it took the allegations seriously and responded appropriately. Evelyn says this is a witch hunt and I am manipulating the evidence to make her look bad because I do not want to pay the fines. I say the fines are bogus and the evidence is objective. Anyone can verify the metadata in the server logs, and if Evelyn wants to dispute it, she can bring her own analysis. Evelyn says she does not need to dispute it because the board knows she has been doing her job correctly, and I am just a troublemaker who refuses to follow the rules. The president says the timeline packet raises enough questions that the board cannot ignore it, and he is suspending all enforcement actions against me pending the outcome of an independent investigation. Evelyn stands up and says she is not going to sit here and be accused of fraud by someone who kicked a traffic cone and damaged HOA property. I say I did not kick the cone, Evelyn did, and it is on the video Ron recorded. Ron nods and says he can provide the video to the board if they want to review it. Evelyn says the video is edited and cannot be trusted, and Ron says the video has a continuous timestamp and metadata showing it was not edited, and he is happy to provide that too. The president says the board will review all the evidence and issue a decision within 10 business days, and in the meantime, Evelyn is to have no contact with me or any other residents involved in the complaint. Evelyn storms out and slams the door, and I sit back down feeling like I just ran a marathon. Ron leans over and says I did a good job. The timeline packet was the knockout punch, and the board has no choice now but to act. The treasurer asks me what I want as a resolution, and I say I want the fines removed, my amenity access restored, and a written apology from the HOA. I also say I want the HOA to stop using predatory towing as an enforcement tactic and to implement a transparent process for rule changes that includes proper notice and board approval. The treasurer says those are reasonable requests and the board will consider them. The meeting ends and Ron walks out with me. He says Evelyn is not going to let this go and I should expect her to try to retaliate again, but now that the board knows what she has been doing, she will have a harder time getting away with it. He also says the HOA attorney looked genuinely concerned, which is a good sign because attorneys do not like liability exposure, and if the attorney is pushing the board to settle, they will probably settle. 2 weeks later, I get a letter from the board saying the independent investigation confirmed that the parking amendment email was created after the tow attempt and that Evelyn had been acting outside her authority in multiple enforcement actions. The letter says the board is removing Evelyn from her role as compliance director and appointing an interim director to review all pending violations. The letter also says the board is refunding the tow and immobilization fees and clearing the ledger of all fines and penalties assessed against me, and Evelyn is being required to retract her claim in writing. The board is also implementing new policies for rule changes and enforcement actions to ensure proper notice and oversight going forward. I get a check in the mail 3 days later, a refund of fees that hits the ledger like a slap, and I deposit it immediately. Ron calls and says Evelyn resigned from the HOA entirely and moved out of the neighborhood, and the board is now facing a class action inquiry from other residents who were targeted by her enforcement tactics. He says my timeline packet opened the door for a lot of people to come forward with their own stories, and the HOA is scrambling to settle before it turns into a full-blown lawsuit. I also get a call from the County Consumer Protection Office saying they opened an investigation into the HOA's towing practices based on my complaint, and they found enough evidence of predatory conduct to issue a compliance order requiring the HOA to stop towing without proper notice and to refund fees to anyone who was wrongfully towed. The investigator says my documentation was critical to the case, and I should be proud of the work I did to hold the HOA accountable. A few weeks later, I run into Ron at the mailboxes, and he says the board is going through a major overhaul, with 2 members stepping down and new elections scheduled for next month. He says he is running for a seat and he is going to push for stronger resident protections and transparency rules, and he thinks the neighborhood is finally ready to take the HOA back from the people who have been using it as a personal fiefdom. I tell him he has my vote, and he says he is counting on it. I still park on the street sometimes, just because it feels safer, but I know the worst is over. Evelyn is gone, the fines are cleared, and the HOA has learned the hard way that paper trails work both ways. I hope you enjoyed the story.